Let me introduce our first speaker for today, Andrei Tognolo. Andrei, am I correct? You're joining us from London. Welcome.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm joining from London.
Great. So I'm excited to welcome Andrei, and he is tech lead of engineering experience team at TransferWise. He has over 13 years of experience, worked for many companies focused on agile methodologies and testing, the companies like Dextra, Systemas, ThoughtWorks. And Andrei will talk about challenges of testing of a system consisting of many services. He'll probably say how many of those they have right now. Great to have you, Andrei, today. Are you ready? Can we kick off?
Yes, I'm ready. Thank you very much.
So let me turn on your presentation, and the stage is yours.
Cool. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for joining us today. Today I'll be talking about tests at TransferWise, the challenge to test a system with more than 300 services. As you already know, I'm Andrei Tognolo. I'm the tech lead of the engineering experience. I worked for TransferWise for around 4 years. And before I get into the content of this presentation, I think that I will give a couple of disclaimers. So first of all, by no means things are perfect at TransferWise. If that's what you expect, I'm sorry to disappoint you. We'll be talking a lot about the challenge, a couple of alternatives that we've been trying and some that are working, but by no means things are perfect there. And also, we have different views across the company. So you cannot expect that everyone in at TransferWise has the same view. What I'm going to be showing here is what I believe that are kind of the direction that most of the teams they are going, but we have highly autonomous teams. So each one of the teams, they actually can define their own strategy for testing. And also we are in a journey and we are looking for engineers to join us in this journey. So if you would like to know more about the open positions that we have, I'll be very happy to talk with you. You can contact me on Twitter or even send me an email. I'll be very happy to talk with you. I would like to present you TransferWise in case you don't know who we are. Our mission is money without borders, instant, convenient, transparent, and eventually free. We started basically as a company for you to send money abroad from one currency to another. Nowadays, we have other products. For example, you can hold money in different currencies. And also you can spend the money that you have in your balance using our plastic card. Currently, we have over 8 million people using TransferWise. We process more than 4 billion transactions every month. So you can imagine that tests are very important for us. From a technical perspective, we have more than 400 engineers, more than 350 services, and our stack is mostly JVM. We run our infrastructure on Kubernetes. We use Kafka a lot, and we have a mix of different databases. So the agenda that I prepared for this talk is basically we start talking about the testing strategy in a monolithic architecture, trying to identify what are the things that we can use and what are the things that we actually should try to leave behind from this type of system. Then after that, we'll be talking about how to define a testing strategy. And then we'll be talking about the testing strategy at TransferWise, where it will be split into 3 topics: the interservice testing, testing production, and on-demand production-like environment. So getting straight into the testing strategy in a monolithic architecture, I think that it was quite common for the monolithic architectures to have some sort of testing strategy like this. You have your coding, you're doing your coding, then you push your code, your change to GitHub, then your continuous integration environment here represented by Circle CI, you run some automated tests, then from there you get a deployable that you deploy in a staging environment, enterprise-wide test environment, where you run some exploratory testing. Then after that, you promote this version to production once you see that everything is working fine. Now I want to talk a little bit more in depth here about 2 of these steps that I think are important. First is the automated tests. So if you think about the automated tests that we run, I think we can classify them into 2 groups. The inter-component tests, those tests that you only need one component to run, and the cross-component tests. You need more than one component to run, for example, for your end-to-end tests. And although we can say that the monolithic architecture has many disadvantages, I think we need to recognize that there was a couple of things that were actually easier with a monolithic architecture. And one of the things is the fact that when you're running these cross-component tests, it's much easier because you actually have all your components bundled together. The other part that I want to talk about this kind of testing strategy is this stage environment where you'll be running exploratory testing. One thing that was quite common is you have your component that you're working, your team is working on one feature, you deploy to staging, you do some tests there, and you see that it's actually working. And then you say, okay, cool, I want to promote this version to production. But then what happens is that there's another team doing something totally unrelated with what you're doing, and then actually they found a bug in what they are developing. And then at this moment, you are basically blocked by another team that has no relation with you. And then we have many techniques to try to avoid these kind of situations. But at some point, we got tired of it. I mean, we said, you know what? What if we split our monolith into smaller services? So if you think, one of the main advantages of the microservices is the ability to deploy one service by itself, independently of the others. And it's very important for us to pay attention to this principle, because if you think about testing strategy that goes against this principle, it's possible that we end up in an architecture where we are actually not using the main advantage of microservice. So if you think now how we would evolve that testing strategy from a monolithic architecture to a microservice, we're thinking about the service having an independent path to production. So each one of the services, which previously were, let's say, the components, now they are services, each one of the services, they have its own integration environment. Now, if you think about the two categories of service that we previously mentioned, they changed a little bit. We're not talking about components, we're talking about services. And if you think about the inter-service test, it's pretty fine. You can still perform them in your continuous integration environment, but how about the cross-service tests? That's where when things get a little bit more complex, like for example, your end-to-end tests, because now you depend on multiple services. And while we could say like, okay, I just need to bring these three services up in my continuous integration environment, that might be true for three services, but how about the 300 services that we will eventually have? Now, because you cannot really run the cross-service testing in your continuous integration for each one of the services, one solution that's quite common for people to come up with is, let's still run our inter-service test in each one of the continuous integration environment of the service, but also let's have an environment, which I'm calling here a stage environment, where we are going to have all the services there, and then we'll be able to perform cross-service tests. And then my question for you is this a good testing strategy for a microservice architecture? The way that I try to frame every time that I see a testing strategy, if it's a good strategy or not, I try to pay attention to the hardest part of the testing strategy. The hardest part is the given. And we tend to neglect the given, I would say. When I say the given, what I mean is that each test that we perform, either automated or manual, we can split into 3 steps. Given that I have something, when something happens, then we're going to expect something. And the given for this kind of testing strategy is actually pretty hard to achieve. So what is the given? It's given that I have a production-like environment, and by its own, that's like really hard to achieve. But it goes beyond that, where all the other services are working properly. What I mean by that is you have this environment where you have all the services there, and you have the service A, and you have a new version to test. And what the service A is expecting is that all the rest of the services, they are working fine. But at the same time, someone else is trying to test the service B. And now they're expecting the same. They're expecting that the service A is actually in a stable version, which it's not. So we end up in a situation that is actually, it's quite brittle, this environment. And that applies for both manual and automated tests. So basically, what the message that I'm trying to convey here is that this idea of having an enterprise-wide testing environment does not seem like a good idea for microservices. And I'm not the only one saying that. If you look ThoughtWorks Tech Creator, in 2017, they are already putting the enterprise-wide integration test environments in hold. And then the question that arises is that, okay, if we used to have the enterprise-wide testing environment, you need telling me that we need to be cautious about using them, we should try to avoid, then what is my alternative? Which brings us to the second point, which is how to define a testing strategy. And there are like many ways of defining a testing strategy, I believe, but I think that we could all agree that there's no silver bullet, or at least we haven't found one. Then what I think that we should actually be asking is, what are the most common incidents in your company? Because each one of the companies, they are going to have different needs. The needs of TransferWise is different than the needs of other companies. And if you think about TransferWise, what we've been trying to do is that we've been trying to make it easy to report and coordinate incidents. So for example, we have a Slack bot where you can easily say that there's an incident happening. You can report an incident, you can say what is happening, and you can put the teams which are involved in this incident. It's going to create a Slack channel, and it will also notify the people on call for those services. And then based on the things that we get from this incident, we have weekly meetings to discuss the most important ones. And then on top of that, we also collect metrics. For example, the rollback percentage, so that we can see, for example, which one are the services that are having more rollbacks and which are the teams that are having more rollbacks, in order to try to understand where we can put our focus, our efforts to improve it. Now that I explained a little bit how we try to think about testing strategy, define a testing strategy, what is the testing strategy for TransferWise? The first point that I want to talk about is the inter-service testing. So the inter-service testing is that test that only requires your service and you can run your continuous integration environment. And I could be talking here about many points about the inter-service test, but I want to focus on 4 of them. Rethinking test pyramid, few mocks, Contra guarantees, and loosely coupled. If we get straight into the test pyramid, any one of us that have been working with software development for more than maybe 5 years, you probably have faced the test pyramid. And you probably have been trying to keep this shape, and you know how hard it is. Most often than not, we end up in a shape that doesn't really resemble a pyramid. But why it was so important for us to keep this shape was because the unit tests, they run much faster than the other type of tests. And in a monolithic application, you have a huge code base, so you have many tests to run. And because of that, if you don't pay attention to the shape of this pyramid, you end up with your continuous integration environment taking hours to run. But we are not in a monolithic architecture anymore. Services in a microservice, they're supposed to be small. So if they are small, even though they might take long to run, you don't have that many tests to run. So what we've been seeing is that more and more teams at TransferWise, what they're trying to do is that they're trying to put less focus on the shape of the pyramid and more focus on the confidence that it brings. And something is important is, as you go upwards in the pyramid, you have more confidence. And because of that, we believe that each one of the service, they should try to find what is the best shape for their pyramid. If it's actually the shape is a pyramid, go for it. But if it's actually a diamond or even a cone, that's still totally fine, as long as the overall time that you run your build does not take maybe 10 or 15 minutes to run. And another point that is quite important when talking about the test pyramid is related with mocks. So imagine this test, for example. You have a test that tests in a class, one specific method of this class, and this is the method is calling then the class B that has a chain of calls. By default, this test would not be a unit test. But in our obsession to have everything as a unit test, what is very common to see people doing is that they end up creating a mock for the class B because they want then this test to become a unit test, which we can even argue if that's still if it's a unit test when you do this mock. Regardless, what is important here is that once you do this mock, you are actually reducing the confidence because you're not using the re-implementation anymore. And another example where we are sometimes obsessed with mocks, when we're talking about external dependencies like Kafka or a database. It's quite common for us to try to mock those things. While in reality, nowadays we have Docker, right? So how long does it take actually to bring a Kafka container up? It's a matter of few seconds. So why not use the real implementation if we can? Well, if I'm saying that we try to avoid mocks, we should try to have as few as possible. Is there any situation where it makes sense to have mocks? The way that I try to frame this problem is that we should try to use the real implementation as much as possible, and only mock what is external to our service, and we cannot use a container. For in the case that we have a test that is testing a class in the service A, and then actually calls the service B, and then the service B calls C, and maybe even longer chain. In this case, you cannot really try to run Docker containers because maybe there are like a lot of dependence downwards. So in this case, it might make sense for you to actually mock the service B. But when you do, we need to be careful with what we're doing, because a mock is basically an assumption. When you have a mock, you're basically saying that you assuming that's how the service is going to behave in production. And even more than that, you're not just saying how it's going to behave now, but you're also saying how it's going to behave in the future. So we need to have some sort of contract guarantees in order to make sure that it will keep working. When I think about contract guarantees, well, I try to think about two different categories. The first is the schema. So let's suppose then that service A is making a call to service B to create a transfer. And in the payload, you have a field called source, and it's like has a value which is a string. And in the response, you have an ID represented by integer. And what these things are, they're schemas, right? And at TransferWise, we are lucky enough to have most of our services running on JVM. And because of that, most of the service they have been doing at TransferWise is that they've been providing a client. So the service B provides a client that the service A puts inside of its service. And this client already has the contract there because you're going to have the interfaces that the service B is giving to you. So for the contract guarantees from the schema perspective, that's how we've been doing TransferWise. And it's been quite useful. Now, if we go another step and we think from the perspective of the semantic guarantee, then things getting a little bit more complex. Suppose that you want to write a test that is asserting that when the source is a currency that does not exist, it actually sends you an error message. That goes beyond the schema. That goes talking more about the semantics. When you get into these situations, then what we believe is that one solution could be consumer-driven contract testing. And we do have some of them at TransferWise, but to be honest, we only have them in some bounded context. So for example, some teams that they are owners of one specific domain, within the service that they own in that domain, they have some contract testing, but it's not something mandatory for all their services at TransferWise. And the reasoning behind is that we've seen that the schemas guarantees that we have, as I presented to you guys, have been actually able to catch most of the issues. It's possible that in the future we are going to go with something to try to verify the semantics as well. But for now, we believe that the cost benefit actually is not paying off for our specific scenario. So I've been talking a lot about the inter-service tests. Well, one thing that is very important for us to have in mind is that as less coupled is our services, higher is going to be our confidence from the inter-service tests. So basically, what I'm trying to say is that if you have a very good, high-quality inter-service test, but even with that, you're not actually confident of deploying to production a change, it might be the case that actually this service is too coupled with others. And then in this case, I think it makes sense for us to rethink about the design of our system. Now, even if we have a very good inter-service test, even if our design is loosely coupled, even so, I think it's fair to ask the question, can we catch all the bugs before they reach production? And I don't have to see you now to know that the answer. You're saying no, it's not possible. Now, the question that follows that is, are we comfortable with that? Are we comfortable with this fact that we won't catch all the bugs before they reach production? And if we're not comfortable, we need to start thinking, what do I need to do in order to be comfortable with this fact? And I believe that although there are like many things that we can do, we already mentioned about having high quality inter-service tests, and there are some other things that we can do, but we should probably start from the fact that not all the bugs, they are equally scary, or at least they should not be equally scary. To give some context, for example, in August, at TransferWise, we did 2,400 releases. And most of them, they went pretty well. But in total, we had 42 incidents that happened in August. And then here you can see that we broke them down into severities. So that severity 1 is the most severe type of incidents that we have. And don't get me wrong, we are going to try to reduce the number of incidents as much as we can, but we will end up always having them. What we also want to do is that we want to have more incidents that are not as severe. And for that, I think it's very important, the next topic that I have in our agenda, which is testing in production. And that's a huge topic, and we could have a whole presentation only for that, but I'll be talking about some of the points that I believe that are worth mentioning about the way that we've been using that in TransferWise. The first one is I couldn't stress enough how monitoring and observability is important. And I want to bring 3 points that have been particularly important for us in this journey. The first one is out-of-the-box dashboards and alerts. So when you create a new service, you get them for free. So that's pretty important. You don't even have to think. Another point is to create business metrics as well and alerts on them. When I say business metrics, what I mean here is that you should have alerts, for example, if the number of transfers that you created in the past 1 minute goes below a threshold. It won't tell you what is the problem, but it will tell you there is something wrong. Another thing that has been quite useful for us is distributed tracing, for which we've been using Jaeger. Another point on testing production is feature toggles, and we have extensive usage. I know that you know what a feature toggle is. You've probably been using them. What I think that is being a lesson for us is to have extensive usage of them. And also not only on and off, this feature is on, this feature is off, but also being able to configure, for example, I want this feature to be enabled only for myself, and then only for my team, only for the TransferWisers, and then maybe for a small set of customers, so on and so forth. And another point, pretty important, is smoke tests. So we've talked previously about cross-service tests. And when we talked about cross-service tests, what we said is that it's pretty hard to have an environment where we have all the services running fine. But we do have an environment where all the services are running fine. It's production. It has to be running fine. And that's where we've been running our cross-service tests. And what these smoke tests they do is that they run every minute. Maybe in the future they will run more often than that. And what they try to do is that they try to test a user journey. For example, creating a transfer. It goes through the steps to create a transfer. And if you combine some of these things we've been talking about, what we would get eventually is an automated canary release. And here we still have some things to improve at TransferWise. We do have some sort of canary release, but it's not fully automated, as I'm describing here. So we are in a journey. And what we imagine as the canary release for the future of TransferWise is that you have your customers. They are accessing your production environment where you have a service and need the service in the V1 of this service. Once you deploy the V2 of this service, it should not be available for our customers because you don't know, you're still not confident that it's working in production. So then your smoke test should be the only one actually accessing that service, that new version. And once it sees that it's actually working, then there is a high chance that it's going to actually work for our customers. So then you start enabling for 1%, 5%, keep monitoring, seeing that this new version is actually working fine, and then eventually it's going to get to 100%. And we believe that as better we get in the areas previously mentioned, less we feel the need to have an integrated pre-production environment. But the reality is that at TransferWise, we still do need an integrated pre-production environment sometimes. And the reason why that's the case is I've talked about being very good on intra-service tests and also being very good on testing in production using things like feature toggles. But in TransferWise case, we're a financial company, and that means that we don't have all the freedom that we'd like to have in order to test in production. So although you could test some things in production, you cannot pretend that you are a Brazilian, for example, in case you are not. So because of these kind of things, we still need sometimes a pre-production environment to help to make us productive. And that's where comes the last of the points in this presentation, the on-demand production-like environment. Why on-demand? It's because we already talked about the fact that a stage environment, this enterprise-wide test environment, doesn't look like a good idea because you're not isolating yourself from the other people or the other engineers. But what if I could have my own staging? And that's where comes the solution that we created. We have the solution working for around a year and a half. And what the solution provides is that anyone inside TransferWise, regardless if you're an engineer or not, but most of the engineers that use this feature for sure, is that you can create an environment only for you. And once you create this environment only for you, you can do whatever you want there. You can deploy the versions that you want. You can bring down services to see how the system behaves, for example, and you are not impacting others in the company. Now, this kind of tool is not very simple to create. It's a quite complex tool. And while creating this tool, we had a couple of principles in mind. The first principle that we had in mind is that it has to be convenient. Otherwise, people wouldn't be using the tool. And for that, we created a Slack bot. So when you want to create an environment, what you do, you go there and you type create in the name of the environment, in this case, create Andrei. And then it's going to, at the end of the process, you're going to have an environment only for you. And this environment that it creates, what you want is that you want it to be as production-like as possible. So things like we want the same versions as in productions, we want the same tools that we have in production, we want the same values of feature toggles that we have, and so on and so forth. But although we want this to be production-like, we also want it to be fast to create. Nowadays, we create an environment in between 5 and 8 minutes to create an environment. But it's important to have in mind that there is some compromise that we need to make between production-like and speed. A good example is databases. In production, we have one instance of the database per service. However, when you're talking about this on-demand environment, what we do is that we have one instance and we split this instance using schemas. Why? Because it's much, much faster for you to create a new schema than for you to create a whole new instance of a database. We also want this environment to be reliable. And don't get me wrong, this solution requires high maintenance. So the engineer experience team, we are the first line of defense when something goes wrong. And then, of course, we proxy to the service owners in case they did something that broke this environment. But also, we have monitoring tools that it keeps constantly creating environment and checking if it's run some smoke tests on these environments and check that they are working fine. And if they are not working fine, then you try to understand, the tools is smart enough to understand what is the problem, like it's one specific service that is causing the problem, so then it does not allow this new version to be propagated to the engineers. So when you do the create command, you're getting the versions which were actually tested and it is guaranteed to be working. Another point that we've been trying to put some effort in is to make this tool not very expensive. A couple of things that we did in order to make it not very expensive is that, first of all, it's ephemeral. This environment lives for 4 hours by default. You can increase, but it still is going to be ephemeral. And when you create this environment, you don't have all the servers that you have in TransferWise. You don't have the 350 servers that you have there. You only have the ones required for you to do a GBP to Euro transfer. But what if I want to do something different than that? If you want to do something different than that, then we have templates. And then you can use this template by running the command as create environment from and the name of the template. In this case, I'm using cards in case I want to test something specific to cards. So it's going to bring the services and the test data related with cards domain. And we try to create this tool having a product mindset. So we ask our customers, or meaning our engineers, how much they like the tool, and what are the things that they would like us to improve. We ask, for example, how likely would you recommend this tool to a TransferWise engineer? And you can see here that in general, people are pretty happy with the tool, but don't let me fool you. This is far from perfect, but still useful. And another point that is quite important here is that we created this tool with the design and with the idea to use it only for exploratory testing. We don't think that you should have your service using this tool. Your service, the continuous integration environment of your service. Why not? Because if you end up using an integrated environment, you will end up coupling the release of your service with other service, and that's what we're trying to avoid. So I'm almost running out of time, so I'll do a quick summary of the message that I've been trying to convey. We need to be careful about staging environments, enterprise-wide testing environments, when we're talking about a microservice architecture. The key for us to be able to be confident without this enterprise-wide test environment relies on inter-service tests and testing production. What happens that at TransferWise, sometimes, and we see that less and less, we are having this need, but we still need sometimes, we need a integrated environment to perform some exploratory testing, and for that we ended up creating an on-demand integrated environment. So that's all that I had to show to you guys. Thank you very much, and I'll be very happy to answer any questions. So feel free to hit me on Twitter or even send me an email. Thank you very much.
Oh, I realized I was on mute. Sorry. So, Andrei, thank you for the presentation. It was awesome. I think we will have a time for one or two questions, and I think the first one comes from Jakub. But isn't mocking about making sure that we are testing only one component and only its logic, not more? Would it increase confidence about this specific component?
Yes, exactly. I think that's exactly the idea. So what we try to do is that if we increase, the way that I'm trying to frame that is, if we increase the confidence of each one of the components, each one of the services that we have, in the end, we're going to have a system that we have more confidence overall. But that alone is not enough. That's why we need a very good testing production strategy as well, like smoke tests and so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I will put out another one from Daniel. What type of testing do you perform before the real production or on the production, and not to block continuous deployment?
Not to test on different versions of the code. What types of tests do you perform before the real production or on the production? Yes. So before going to production, what types of tests that we perform is only the intra-service tests, the ones that you can perform only using your service, right? So you can do any kind of test there that you need, or you can even use some implementations like Kafka and your database and so on and so forth, but only in intra-service. And then when you go to production, then we have the smoke tests. The smoke tests are doing the cross-service tests. Now, it's going to depend on your need, of course. Imagine that you're deploying something that you know that can have some impact on your performance, the performance of your service. So then before that, you're going to probably run some tests in isolation for that service to make sure that it's going to work fine. And also when you go to production, you're going to do in a canary release way, so that even though you can then monitor and check if your performance is working accordingly. So it's going to, I think that my question here is like, it's going to depend on the type of change that you're making.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Andrei, Thanks a lot. Thank you again for being with us.